Good.
See if I have any messages from anybody,
We have a
but
quorum
you
now.
you
That's
can
good.
continue on
Good.
while I do that.
Let's call to order the Board Administrative Performance Committee at 9 o'clock. We'll call into order. Do we need to do roll call, or we just assumed everybody's alive and well?
We can do roll call.
Hey, City of Delray Oaks.
Here.
City of Greenfield.
Here.
City of Monterey.
Here.
City of Seaside.
Here.
City of Soledad.
His backpack is here. He's here, but
In
he's.
spirit, he's here.
Joining us shortly.
County of Monterey. So we do have one.
Great. Okay, public comment on matters not on the agenda. The members of the public may address the committee on any matter related to the jurisdiction of MST, but not on the agenda. There's a time limit not to exceed 3 minutes per speaker. The public is encouraged to engage in respectful dialogue that supports freedom of speech and values diversity of opinion. Failure to gauge respectful dialogue will result in speakers being muted or required to leave. The committee will not take action on or respond immediately to any public comment presented, but may choose to follow up at a later time, either individually through staff or subsequent agendas. Is there any public comment? Going through time. Okay, so there is no public comment. Consent agenda to approve minutes to the Board Administrative Performance Committee on November 4th, 2024. That's the item on the consent agenda.
I'll move to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Good. Item 4, review of the administrative performance relating to item 7-1.
Yeah,
Carl?
just in your monthly reports and general manager's report, just to review. We're reporting our January 2025 results in this packet, and we see another increase of 9.5% over the previous January. That's 24 solid months in a row of constant increased ridership since the implementation of the Better Bus Network.
Terrific.
So as you see in your board reporting packages, you're seeing ridership continuing to increase in disadvantaged communities, which was one of the goals of the Better Bus Network as well. And we had our first full month of ridership with the South County circulators, and happy to report that the new routes in Gonzales and Soledad had more ridership that January than they did the previous January using the MST on call. So that kind of was our proof that, you know, what we're doing with the moving from on call to fixed route circulators is resulting in increased usage of public transportation in those communities. Continuing to work with the City of Greenfield on their stops and challenges at the Santa Lucia market. And so, you know, just letting you know that's ongoing, and numerous meetings have occurred trying to solve that challenge. That concludes my report.
Are there any questions on that? Being none. 4-2, review state legislative bills regarding transit funding and driver safety. Michelle Overmeyer and Matt Robinson.
Good morning, committee members. Michelle Overmeyer, Director of Planning and Innovation. On page 69 of your full agenda package, you'll see the complete written state legislative update. Matt Robinson and Michael Pimentel with Shaw, Yoder, Antwi, Smelzer, and Lang are with us to talk about things in Sacramento, and they'll go into more detail about specifically these two items, the $2 billion in transit assistance funding, and then a bill aimed to enhance safety and security on onboard public transit. So I'll hand it over to Matt and Michael.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing us to present today. as Michelle said, we'll do a quick overview of sort of where we're at in the session, talk through a few pieces of legislation, then I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Michael Pimentel to discuss the budget request that's been made, as well as where we see the cap and trade extension heading in 25/early 26. But let me begin by updating you all with a point in time on where we're at in the legislative session. As we noted in your report, February 21st was the final day to introduce bills in the legislature for the first year of the two-year session. We had a point in time when we submitted our report at 1,600. That number has grown to about 3,500 bills introduced in the first year of the session. And so quite a bit of legislation that we've had to make our way through, and we continue to do that because I would just note we see a number of pieces of legislation that start out as what are referred to as spot bills or intent bills, meaning they don't have substance in them. There are some deadlines looming for those bills to gain that substance in order for them to move through the policy committees. And those deadlines will be mid-March for the Assembly and late March for the Senate. So we should see those pieces of legislation that are currently spot bills either take shape, or there'll be some pretty clear signals that they won't be moving forward in 2025. However, they would be considered two-year bills and could be picked up for a substantive bill in 2026 as part of the second year of the two-year session. Michelle noted a couple of bills that we are tracking for you. There are more that will be in your report next month that will provide some benefits to MST. For example, there was a bill introduced in the Senate that is sponsored by the California Transit Association that would extend the state sales tax exemption for the purchase of zero-emission vehicles. So we'll be bringing that bill back next month, and we'll go into a bit more detail there. But let me begin by touching on a couple of bills that we have in your board report. One is SB 71. This is a bill by Senator Wiener that would authorize the continuation beyond 2030 of a number of statutory exemptions that exist for public transit and active transportation projects. I would note for you all that one of the larger projects that's been done under this statutory exemption that it's been around since 2020 is the SURF BRT project. But as we collectively have learned lessons from other transit agencies, from local governments who have worked to implement these statutory exemptions, there continues to be refinement needed in the code section. And so I would say that SB 71 is sort of the latest iteration of trying to further refine the Public Resources Code as it speaks to those statutory exemptions. The list is expanding slightly only to make sure that we're catching modes, for example, like shuttles and microtransit or other investments that have come forward that are in need, of just further clarification in the statutes. So it's not a sweeping change of the codes, merely sort of chipping away around the edges on some cleanup, if you will. But we do expect that bill to be heard in the Senate Environmental Quality Committee next week on March 19th. And then it also is referred to the Senate Transportation Committee, which is a first for these types of legislation. We haven't seen them go to the Transportation Committee in the past, but we'll work through that committee as we continue to push that bill forward. The other one that Michelle touched on in her opening remarks was AB 394. This is a bill by the Assembly Transportation Committee Chair Lori Wilson that is a co-sponsored piece of legislation by the California Transit Association and a number of our labor unions, including ATU and the Teamsters. The goal of this bill is to expand what are existing assault and battery enhancements for certain public transit employees, like your drivers or your ticket agents, to all folks that might be working for the public transit system. So think your station agents, your maintenance crews that are out there, your janitors that might be working in stations, et cetera, et cetera. So that would carry with it higher fines and potentially prison sentences for folks that are convicted of that enhanced assault and battery provision in the statute. And so we hope to move that piece forward. Additionally, there are two other elements of the bill. One would allow trespass to be enforced as a misdemeanor for certain types of trespass violations on all different transit systems. Currently, it's a provision of the statute that is available to the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, and we are trying to allow all operators in the state to utilize that trespass section in the penal code. And then finally, the third leg of the stool on the legislation is the ability for the courts, if petitioned by a transit agency, to issue stay away orders or prohibition orders to folks that are convicted of either of those two things that I just mentioned, and bar them from entering the transit facilities, your vehicles, et cetera, during that prohibition order period, with the goal of, again, protecting drivers and riders. There's a number of other bills that I mentioned. I think I've probably taken up too much time. Carl and I actually have a separate agenda item where we'll come talk about MST sponsored piece of legislation. But for now, Michelle, I will go ahead and turn it over to Michael Pimentel to talk about the budget request that's out there in cap and trade. And then we're happy to take questions on either the bills that I discussed in detail or anything else that the committee may want to ask us. Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and good morning. Did want to give a brief update on where we are relative to the state budget. We did previously report the governor released his proposed budget for the fiscal year 25-26 in January. There was some good news there relative to the maintenance of transit dollars that were previously approved. Right now, however, there are some ongoing discussions within the legislature on reviewing those proposals included in the governor's budget and considering additional proposals that may be included as the legislature begins to evaluate more formally the development of the full budget and then works with Governor Newsom to finalize a budget by this summer. One of those proposals that's being considered is a $2 billion request that was filed by Senator Jesse Ottagine, new senator from Berkeley, as well as Assemblymember Mark Gonzalez from Los Angeles. That request is attempting to provide additional funding support to California transit agencies for operations and for capital projects, with the focus on driving toward the investment types that were eligible under the previous $5.1 billion package, that is SB 125. In filing their requests, the legislators were joined by 12 additional legislators asking for this support from legislative and budget leadership. And it is something that we anticipate will be reviewed more fully, again, as the legislature continues its work on budget development. I'll note that at this time, key details about the funding request, including distribution and fund source, have not yet been identified, but would be identified if ultimately we find receptivity in the legislature to move that request forward. I'll make note that MST was one of the early supporters of moving that request forward from a stakeholder perspective. I mentioned the legislators submitting their requests. There was a coalition sign-on letter that included more than 60 organizations to help provide some additional support in getting that request formalized. Again, that was supported by MST as it was introduced. Now, with regards to cap and trade, I'll highlight for you that today, California transit agencies benefit from a 15% ongoing annual investment from the cap and trade program. When I say 15%, I mean 15% of all annual revenues generated by that program are directed toward public transit. There is a need for the legislature and the governor to make movement toward the reauthorization of the cap and trade program. That's because cap and trade is set to expire in 2030. And so conversations are just now getting underway in the legislature to consider the principles for reauthorization. Part of that is focused on the revenue mechanism that is ultimately a means of reducing emissions, but then also, too, on the expenditures of those revenues that go to a variety of purposes, including, again, public transit. We anticipate that later this spring, beginning in April, the legislature will begin to hold hearings in the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 4 that oversees resources, transportation, and climate change, as well as in the Senate Select Committee, or through the Senate Select Committee, to consider how they will move forward. Those conversations are ongoing. And the engagement from the public transit end is principally led by the California Transit Association that's working to organize its members, including MST, to ultimately move forward with some recommendations, some advocacy to ultimately deliver the maximum share of investment from cap and trade in public transit beyond 2030. And so with that, happy to take any questions or comments on this update.
Thank you. Does any board members have any questions? Anybody from the general public, any questions? Seeing none. Want to thank you very much, and we're going to review 4-3 View AB 761 Monterey Salinas Transit District Retail Transactions and Use Tax. Matt and Carl.
Yeah, I'll just tee Matt up. If you recall, last spring, your board received some polling information from MST about the appetite that the electorate would have for a renewal of Measure Q, the 1/8 of 1% sales tax that will expire in 2029 at the end of its 15-year life. And on top of that, we did some split polling to get the sense of support for an additional 1/8 of 1% that might be used for MST's regular fixed route services. Just as a reminder, MST does not have any local tax funds dedicated to its fixed route services, the big buses that carry 90+% of our passengers. We do have the special sales tax, just the special mobility programs for seniors and veterans and persons with disabilities. And well, you'll see foreshadowing for next month's or the May budget report for this committee. You're seeing some of MST's fixed route general funds are having to subsidize the special programs because the sales tax revenue isn't enough. So what we found in that polling was that there was a very large support for renewal of Measure Q, and we were just at 2/3 and slightly above for support of an additional 1/8, but we neither had the time nor did we think it was strategically something that we wanted to put on this past ballot. And so we're looking at a ballot in potentially 26, which then, if that's unsuccessful, gives us another chance in 28 to renew this. We are at in at least one of our cities in our county, we're at the current 10% cap that's allowable for local sales taxes in combination. What this would do would not count any sales tax measure that MST were to put forward for the renewal of 1/8 and a possible 1/8 increase, would not count that 1/8 of 1% towards that cap. And that's really the gist of this whole legislation. It would allow us to put this on. It does not. It is not anything that is creating a tax. It's not a new tax that's being implemented. It just allows, if this board should at a future date in 26 or 28 choose to add something to the ballot, if the polling indicates that it's the right thing to do, then those increases won't be counted against your local city's caps. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt as far as process and to correct anything I may have said.
No, thanks, Carl. So I'll talk a little bit about process. We do have legislation, as noted in your report, AB 761, that's being carried by our very own Assemblymember Addis. As Carl noted, the bill would give us the authority for extending both the 1/8 cent existing Measure Q tax plus adding an additional 1/8 if the board, your board, excuse me, desires to go down that road and the voters are showing support for that. The bill is going to be heard in several policy committees through the legislative process. We start with a hearing in the Assembly Local Government Committee, then we will go to the Rev and Tax Committee, and we'll likely repeat that process in the Senate. We don't expect any issues. These types of bills are pretty normal for members to carry. They're usually considered district bills. And as long as the delegation from the district is okay with it, which ours is, we shouldn't have any challenges moving the bill forward. We may see some amendments just related to the structure as we move through committee, meaning we may not have said it the right way, is probably the best way to put it. But early indications seem like we're on the right track. I would just reiterate, we are not doing anything around what has been, I think, showing up in a lot of these bills in the last couple of years, which is the voter initiative process. And so if we were to move forward with this after the legislation authorizes the board to do so, it would still require a 2/3 vote of the voters of Monterey County in order to move the extension or the extension plus the additional 8th forward. Carl touched on when those elections might be happening. Carl will be here in Sacramento tomorrow, and we're going to go have some meetings with the committee staff as well as some members of our delegation just to talk through some of the background on the legislation. And of course, we'll be reporting back to the board and the committee, excuse me, as the bill moves forward in 2025. Carl, I'm happy to answer any questions, but hopefully that covered what you needed me to cover.
I'll leave that to the board to decide. What is it? Are there any
Board have any
questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, question for Matt. Luis Alejo, has there been precedent for a bill like this that would allow an increase in a tax that 1/8, but not count toward the 10%?
Absolutely. It's pretty common, Supervisor Alejo. In fact, most bills that we have seen and or ran for other folks in our client stable in recent years have all included that provision where you have this notwithstanding the local limits, you can go above. So it will not count towards that. And that is one of the things that I think local government committee may want us to say slightly different in the legislation, but it is there right now. We just may need to wordsmith it a little bit. But yes, sir, that is correct.
All right, thank you.
And most recently, and probably closest in geography, Senator Laird ran this very same language for Santa Cruz Metro in the last session, which
That's
is
correct.
we call it the case style of management where we copy and steal everything.
Yeah.
So we're copying liberally from the Sacramento, the Santa Cruz
Right.
legislation.
You mean best practices?
Oh, yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Is there any other questions from the committee? Anybody from the audience or residents or online? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
4-4, update on federal legislative activities, Don Gilchrist.
Not much going on in Washington, D.C.
Any comments there, sir?
We need to unmute Don Gilchrist. There we go.
Okay, thank you, folks. Good morning, everyone, chair and members of the committee. There is quite a bit going on the federal level, but this week the focus is on appropriations. Congress must pass appropriations legislation this week because the current continuing resolution will expire on Friday, and that's the legislation that has kept the federal government operating. Republican leaders are bringing to the floor of the House this week a full year continuing resolution, which will extend last year's funding levels through the rest of this current fiscal year. And this is essentially them giving up on passing the 12 individual appropriations bills and defaulting to a continuing resolution that will just kind of postpone difficult decisions until the next round of appropriations, which will be happening immediately after this gets enacted. Essentially, the full year continuing resolution will prevent difficult cuts to programs that were proposed in the House bills last year in the areas of non-defense spending, including several transportation grant programs. And under the full year continuing resolution, I expect that the FTA funding that MST relies on through your formula program should be intact and should be no problem. One of the downsides of doing it this way is that there will be no project earmarks for fiscal year 2025. And that means that the $1 million that we were able to secure in the Senate transportation bill for the King City hydrogen retrofits will be stranded. It will not have a pathway forward to be enacted this year. And that's happening to all of the project earmarks that were pending in the House and Senate bills. There is a concern among House Democrats, especially, that the continuing resolution gives the Trump administration too much decision-making authority. This has been very sensitive because of the administration's actions to pause or freeze funding and also widespread reductions in force for federal agencies. And House Democrats are likely to oppose this continuing resolution. And that means the vote counts will be very, very tight. I'm assuming that it will pass on a party line vote in the House, and it's looking like Senate Democrats will give it enough support that it will make it through the Senate. However, there is that small potential for an impasse that could result in a government shutdown. That possibility is fading away moment by moment. It's getting more and more likely that this does get enacted by the end of the week. I think then the administration will start to think about fiscal year 26. The budget is normally proposed by the president in February, and obviously that hasn't happened yet. Once they get through 25, I think we'll see something coming out of the administration to propose the start of the appropriations process for the next year. And I think we're going to be revisiting many of the same themes where congressional Republicans would like to increase defense spending while restraining or reducing non-defense spending. And that is likely to impact the competitive grant programs at the Department of Transportation. But so far, the formula programs have not been pulled into those types of arguments, and we'll be advocating for that moving forward for FY26. I do think there'll be another opportunity to request project earmarks, and perhaps there'll be an opportunity to revisit the King City project or others that are pending. And we're already starting to talk to your local delegation about those opportunities. Running in the background is that strange legislative procedure called budget reconciliation. This is completely separate from appropriations. It's a separate process and runs on a separate timeline. The budget reconciliation is a powerful tool that the Republicans can use to enact many of the Trump administration's priorities. And the first step is adoption of a budget resolution. That sets the framework for this process. The House did pass a budget resolution in February, and they're working out the details with the Senate so that the House and Senate can agree on a final version. If they're able to adopt the identical budget resolution, then the reconciliation process can start. This is potentially a concern to MST because baked into the House proposal are about $2 trillion in cuts to mandatory spending over 10 years. That could have big impacts on renewable energy programs, electric vehicle programs, climate programs that were enacted in the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't think it will impact the infrastructure spending that was enacted in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That is probably not doable through reconciliation. Doesn't mean they won't try to get at that money another way, especially in the area of what they are calling anything related to EV mandates or Green New Deal spending. But it doesn't look like it will happen through budget reconciliation. The legislative committees have to kind of come up with the specifics that can then be assembled into the reconciliation bill, and The leadership is hoping to accomplish all of this by Memorial Day weekend. They'd like to have that passed and signed into law before breaking for that recess. Long way to go. There's a lot of commitments that have been made by Republican leaders that are going to be hard to hold to and work out. And so we're continuing to watch that and look for the specifics that may impact you, which we'll be reporting on as soon as we know about them. Finally, I wanted to remind you that surface transportation reauthorization is on the horizon. This is the multi-year bill that authorizes funding for highway transit, rail, and highway safety programs. It will expire, the current one will expire in 2026, and that means we want to be starting this year to make our case for the priorities. I do think the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee may be able to draft its version of the bill before the end of the year, but this is going to be a process that drags on for quite a while. Into and beyond 2026, it's quite common for this process to require extensions so that the final details can be worked out. The big thing that's running in the background for surface transportation reauthorization is how is it going to be paid for? The Highway Trust Fund is currently solvent, but as they project what is needed for the future, they can see a $211 billion shortfall just to continue the current spending plus inflation that was enacted in the infrastructure law. So that will be a big one for Congress to work out. They've managed to thread that needle multiple times in the past, but it could exert some pressure to restrain or constrain the size of the legislation. So that's a big one that we'll be paying attention to. Those are the highlights or the lowlights of what's going on in Washington, D.C. Now I'll pause there and see if you have any questions for me.
Board members have any questions?
I have a comment.
Go, yes, sir.
Don, this is Supervisor Luis Alejo. We were up in Washington last week for an county's legislative conference. I think the cities are up there this week. So it's an interesting time. But I think in all my years in politics, I've never seen the dismay on the faces of many Congress members of what they're seeing happen in our nation's capital. But I thought maybe get your insights on transportation, because the transportation secretary recently said or mentioned that federal dollars coming to transportation projects, that they would attach strings to it, including that, well, I don't know how they would do that, but for example, that any agencies getting federal dollars for projects, that they would have to agree to cooperate on immigration enforcement. The other concern I had was just the tariffs, having an impact not only on added cost for housing, but I would assume added cost for transportation projects on steel and other materials that are needed to realize those projects. I wanted to see what your thoughts are on those two issues and what you're hearing up there.
Well, I think from the county and city perspective, the concern is probably the possibility of significant cuts to Medicaid, food stamps, temporary assistance for needy families program, and the Social Security block grant. I'm certainly aware of tracking that. I think there's a likelihood that some or all of those programs could experience deep cuts through the reconciliation process. But what's interesting is just to hear the contradictory messages that are being issued by the White House and Republican leaders. On the one hand, they promise deficit hawks deep spending cuts. On the other hand, they're promising the Republicans that are in marginal districts that they don't have anything to worry about. The president has excluded Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid from cuts, and people are saying that the math doesn't add up if you exclude all those programs. So it's very much up in the air how that will play out. And I think what you would want to do is pay attention to the specifics that are drafted by the legislative committees when they assemble the reconciliation bill. That would happen sometime in April-ish, I believe. probably. We'll start to see that. And as far as the other side of the coin is just the insistence of the Trump administration to use executive authority and administrative actions aggressively, and that has created some consternation and some disruptions. What I can say about that is that many of those actions are running into legal challenges. The courts have issued temporary restraining orders and injunctions regarding the pause of funding, regarding the layoffs or the firings or reduction in force, however you want to say it, of federal personnel. And but those are just temporary legal steps that allow the courts to then look and see what is the underlying legal issue, if anything. And so I think there's a lot to come in the future on in those areas. And what we kind of have seen so far is a constant rollout from the White House of proposals, and sometimes they stick and sometimes they don't. So I think you can kind of expect that to continue.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, Carl, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond specifically to the question from supervisor. From what I've heard in the industry is that I attended a presentation that stated that, at least for the Secretary of Transportation, it was stated in such a manner that the Secretary has broad authority to change the terms of agreements after the agreements have been agreed to. I have found that surprising. I went into our own agreements. I failed to find that language, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist somewhere. I do want to go in and maybe research with Don at a later date, the actual enabling legislation of the capital investment grant program in the authorization statutes themselves to see if there's something there. So I've heard that the Secretary could change terms requiring, reduction of COVID mandates or other, issues that you brought up. And so far, I'm not able to find it. One piece of good news that we had is that there was some question whether this administration would honor the commitments of the past administration. And as you know, we had our SURF grant awarded in the last few days of the prior administration, and we've submitted for our first reimbursement of about $500,000, and the money was deposited into our checking account, no muss, no fuss. And we've made a second application for some additional funds, and we're hoping that remains the case. So while there's been a lot of, angst about this, our experience has been that those commitments are being honored today. So that's some slight good news.
Stays that way.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, it's just a question for Carl. Can you remind us how much of our budget is dependent on federal money?
About 20%. We get about $12 million a year in operating money, depending on capital grants. Like currently we have this huge $22 million, and we'll get earmarks anywhere from $1 million to $3 million, depending whether we can get through the process or not. As you just heard, it seems our $1 million grant, which was the only transportation infrastructure grant in the entire Senate bill for the state of California. And it seems like that's not going to make it through now. Generally, you can count on about 20% or about $12 million. If you look at our capital reserves, though, we're healthy there, and we can withstand an extended period of delays in federal funding because we had this experience before in 2012 where we didn't get funding for a year or so from the federal government, and it nearly drove us into insolvency. So after that point, we've made a decision to secure funding and keep really healthy reserves, and should something like that happen again.
Okay, good. That's good.
Thank you. Any questions from the public? Seeing none. I think that's no closed session, so it is 9:40 and seeing nothing else, let's adjourn this meeting. That's it.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy the coffee.